She was hired to teach the Earl's daughter to read. Instead, she taught the entire household what her employer had spent 10 years hiding. Eleanor Marsh arrived at Blackmoor Hall on a grey October morning, carrying one trunk, a borrowed recommendation letter, and a name that was not entirely her own. The housekeeper who opened the door looked her over once. Plain wool coat, unremarkable face, ink stains still faintly visible on her right hand, and decided instantly that she was of no consequence. "You'll take your meals with the staff," the housekeeper said, already turning away. "His lordship rarely speaks to the governess directly. Best you understand that now." Eleanor understood a great many things the housekeeper did not. She understood, for instance, that her brother Thomas had walked these same halls 3 years earlier as a clerk in the estate office, and that he had written to her only once in his final month, in a letter she still carried folded inside her sleeve. "Nell, the numbers do not add. I have shown Pierce and he tells me to forget what I have seen. I do not think I can." 2 weeks later, Thomas was dead, thrown from his horse on the North Road, the estate said, a tragic accident on a night he had no reason to be riding at all. Eleanor had spent 3 years teaching other people's children in other people's houses, learning patience she did not feel and silence she despised, waiting for a position to open at Blackmoor itself. When it finally did, she wrote the letter of recommendation herself, in a hand practiced enough to pass, and signed it with the name of a clergyman conveniently deceased. She was not here to fall in love with a house that had swallowed her brother whole. She was here to find out what it had done with him. The Earl's daughter, Charlotte, was 7 years old and fiercely lonely, having lost her mother the previous winter and in every practical sense her father as well. Julian Ashcombe had retreated so completely into the running of his estate that his own child startled when he entered a room. "You needn't be nervous of me," Eleanor told her on the first afternoon, when Charlotte flinched at the sound of the study door. "I promise I am far more frightened of your father than you are." Charlotte considered this with the grave seriousness only children manage convincingly. "Everyone is frightened of Papa. Except Mr. Pierce." Eleanor kept her hands very still on the primer in her lap. "And why is that, do you think?" "Papa trusts him," Charlotte said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world, and returned to her letters. Eleanor met the Earl himself only at week's end, summoned to his study to give an account of Charlotte's progress. Julian Ashcombe was younger than she had expected and colder, a man who had trained his grief into something that looked, from the outside, like discipline. He did not rise when she entered. He asked 3 brief questions about his daughter's lessons and seemed prepared to dismiss her before she had properly sat down. Then his gaze moved, almost carelessly, to the ledger book resting on the corner of his desk, an old estate account book, the kind kept in the clerk's office rather than the family rooms, and Eleanor's composure slipped for exactly 1 second too long. "You recognize that binding?" Julian said. "Not a question. I have seen account books before, my lord. I was raised by a man who kept them. It was not technically a lie. Her father had been a clergyman with a parish ledger and a horror of debt." He did not look convinced, but he let it pass, filing the moment away rather than discarding it, the way a careful man files away anything that does not quite fit. "Tell me, Miss Marsh. When my daughter's tenant farm rent accounts came up in her arithmetic lesson yesterday, Mrs. Hale reported this to me. She listens at doors. You should know that about her. You told Charlotte that a debt owed for 3 years running without a single payment recorded is unusual. Not impossible. Unusual. It is unusual, my lord. Most governesses would not know that. Most governesses were not raised watching a ledger, my lord." Eleanor held his gaze a moment longer than was wise. "Forgive me. I only meant that numbers which never change are usually numbers no one is permitted to look at closely." Something shifted behind his eyes, not suspicion of her, not yet, but the specific unease of a man realizing a door he had never questioned might, in fact, be locked from the wrong side. "That will be all, Miss Marsh." She curtsied and left, and did not allow herself to breathe properly until she reached the corridor, where she found Mr. Pierce waiting, pleasant, silver-haired, utterly still, as though he had known exactly how long the interview would take. "The new governess," he said warmly, extending nothing, not even a hand. "Settling in, I trust?" "Very well, thank you, Mr. Pierce." "Good. It is a quiet household, Miss Marsh. We prefer it to remain so." He smiled, and it did not reach anywhere near his eyes. Curiosity is a fine quality in a child's tutor. Less so in anyone else. Eleanor smiled back just as pleasantly and said nothing at all, because she had already decided, standing in that corridor with her brother's handwriting folded against her wrist, that she had no intention of remaining quiet for very much longer. Winter settled over Blackmoor slowly, the way it settled over most things in that house, quietly, and without anyone quite agreeing to let it in. Eleanor found her days falling into an unexpected rhythm. Mornings with Charlotte, who had begun, cautiously, to laugh again. Afternoons in the small library, where she was technically permitted only to select books for lessons but where she lingered longer than necessary, drawn less to the shelves than to the fact that Julian Ashcombe so often worked there himself, at the far desk, pretending not to notice how long she stayed. "You read faster than any governess I've employed," he said one evening, not looking up from his correspondence. "I read quietly, my lord. There's a difference. Quiet people are rarely credited with speed." He did look up then, something almost like amusement crossing his face before he remembered himself and smoothed it away. "Is that a general observation, Miss Marsh, or a personal grievance?" "Both, I find, tend to be the same thing." It became, without either of them naming it, a kind of ritual, a few minutes of conversation before he retreated back into his ledgers and she into her books. He spoke of his late wife only once, obliquely, mentioning that Charlotte had her mother's stubbornness, and Eleanor recognized in his voice the particular flatness of a man who had grieved so long alone that he no longer trusted himself to grieve properly in company. She found, against every instinct she had arrived with, that she did not want to dislike him. That made what she was doing harder, not easier. She had begun, in the hour after Charlotte's bedtime, slipping down to the old clerk's office, and used since her brother's death, the desks left half arranged as though someone might return to them any day. Mrs. Hale believed her sentimental, wandering the house at night. No one believed a governess capable of anything more purposeful than sentiment, which was, Eleanor had learned long ago, the precise blindness she intended to use against them. The ledgers were locked, but the key had not been changed in 3 years, and her brother had taught her, half as a joke, how his own father's old desk locks worked. What she found, over 4 careful nights, confirmed everything Thomas's letter had only gestured toward. Tenant rents recorded as unpaid for years running. Families who, when she quietly asked around the village on her one free Sunday, swore they had paid every quarter without fail in coin into Mr. Pierce's own hand. The difference between what was collected and what was recorded sat, year after year, in a separate account under Pierce's name alone, dressed up as estate maintenance, though half the tenant cottages hadn't seen a new roof beam in a decade. And beneath a false panel at the back of Thomas's old desk, wrapped in oilcloth, his personal notes, dated the same month as his death, naming the discrepancies one by one in his own cramped hand, and a final line that made Eleanor sit very still in the dark for a long time before she could make herself move again. "Told P. I intend to bring this to his lordship directly. He asked me to reconsider. I will not." She did not sleep that night. The following week, Pierce found a reason to summon her. He did not raise his voice, he never did, but he set down in front of her, almost gently, a letter of dismissal already drafted in his own hand, her false clergyman's reference exposed beside it. "I make inquiries about anyone who takes an unusual interest in this estate, Miss Marsh. It is, you understand, a habit born of long and careful service." He folded his hands. "I could have you removed from this house within the hour, and no magistrate in the county would question it, given the character of your references. Or you could remember, as your brother eventually failed to, that some doors are best left closed." Eleanor's hands did not shake, though everything beneath her skin wanted them to. "My brother didn't fail to remember anything, Mr. Pierce. He remembered exactly what he'd seen. That's why you couldn't afford to let him keep remembering it." Something flickered across Pierce's composed face, the first genuine crack she had seen in him, before he smoothed it away and rose to show her the door. She did not have to leave that day. But 2 mornings later, Julian summoned her to his study with a coldness she had not heard from him since her very first week, the false reference letter lying open on his desk between them like an accusation already decided. "I am told," he said, "that you are not who you claim to be." Eleanor stood very straight and did not look away. "No, my lord. I am not." He waited, jaw tight, for an explanation, and for one long moment, watching him, she understood exactly how easy it would be to lose everything she had come here to finish, over a truth he had not yet decided he was ready to hear. "My name is Eleanor Marsh," she said. "But my brother's name was Thomas, and 3 years ago this house told you he stole from you and rode off a cliff in shame. That was a lie, my lord. And I can prove it if you're finally willing to let someone show you the numbers Mr. Pierce has spent a decade making sure you never saw." For a long moment, Julian said nothing at all. Eleanor watched him absorb it, not with the explosive disbelief she had braced for, but with something worse. The slow, visible collapse of a man realizing how much of his own house he had never actually looked at. His hand moved, almost without his permission, to the false reference letter still lying open between them. Thomas Marsh, he said finally quietly. I remember the name. Pierce told me he'd falsified tenant receipts. That he was ashamed and rode out that night rather than face the magistrate. Pierce told you a great many things, my lord. I'd like to show you what my brother actually wrote before he died. She placed the oilcloth-wrapped notes on the desk between them, Thomas's cramped, careful hand, 3 years of discrepancies laid out line by line, and that final sentence Julian read twice, his face going very still. I intend to bring this to his lordship directly. He asked me to reconsider. I will not. He came to see me, Julian said slowly, something cold moving through his voice. I remember now. Pierce told me he'd requested the meeting to confess. I never let him in the room. Because Mr. Pierce made certain you didn't. Julian sat back, and for the first time since she'd known him, Eleanor watched the careful architecture of his composure genuinely falter. Pierce has managed this estate since before my father died. He kept us solvent when I was too young and too grieved to manage it myself. He is not merely my steward, Miss Marsh, he is very nearly family. I understand loyalty, my lord. I buried the only family I had left because of what that loyalty cost him. Eleanor did not soften her voice. You don't have to choose between believing me and believing him forever. You only have to open the ledgers yourself and see which one of us is lying. He did. It took 3 days, quiet, grim days in which Julian barely left the old clerk's office, cross-referencing tenant testimonies against Pierce's books with his own hand, refusing to trust the task to anyone else. By the end of it, the truth was no longer a question anyone in the house could pretend not to see. A decade of inflated rents, phantom repairs, and a private account swollen with money that belonged to families who had gone without new roofs and warm coats to pay for it. Julian called a meeting of the tenants in the great hall rather than confronting Pierce privately, a decision Eleanor had not suggested, but recognized, watching him make it, as the first truly steady choice she'd seen him make since her arrival. Pierce did not deny it once the ledgers were read aloud. He simply watched Julian with the wounded, disbelieving expression of a man who had genuinely believed his decade of quiet theft constituted loyal service. Everything I did to keep this estate afloat, Pierce said. Your father would have understood that. You are too young to remember what this house looked like before I. You let a man die rather than let him be honest with me, Julian said. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. Whatever you believe you preserved, Mr. Pierce, it was never worth that. Pierce was dismissed within the hour, the constable sent for by evening. It solved nothing about Thomas, 3 years too late for that, but Eleanor felt, watching Pierce's carriage disappear down the drive, something in her chest unclench for the first time since she'd read her brother's last letter. The reforms came slower and mattered more. Julian rebuilt the tenant accounts from scratch, with independent oversight and receipts read aloud at quarterly meetings so no single man could bury the truth in a locked drawer again. He offered Eleanor the position of estate clerk outright, a genuine role, her real name on the ledger books this time, and she surprised them both by hesitating. I didn't come here for a position, my lord. I know. He did not press her. You came here for your brother. I can't give him back to you. I can only tell you that I intend to run this house so that what happened to him cannot happen to anyone else in it, and I would like you to stay and hold me to that if you're willing. She thought of Thomas's cramped handwriting, of 3 years spent teaching other people's children while she waited for a door to open. I'll stay, she said. But not because you're offering it, my lord. Because it's work worth doing. There's a difference. You did tell me that once, about reading quickly. I did. Winter eased into spring and the ritual they'd never quite named in the library resumed, though it no longer required pretending. Julian found reasons to walk to the clerk's office in the evenings that had nothing to do with figures. Eleanor found she no longer minded when he stayed. He did not propose with a ring, or in the great hall where the truth had finally been spoken aloud. He found her instead at Thomas's old desk one evening, going over the season's tenant accounts by lamplight, and simply sat across from her the way he had that very first week, except this time he did not wait for her to speak first. I owe you an estate that finally deserves the people who keep it standing, he said. I don't know what I have to offer you beyond that. Eleanor set down her pen. You could start, she said, by admitting you still can't balance the Westfield column without my help. He almost smiled. That I can admit freely. Then that's a start worth having, she said and did not look away.